October 15, 1945. Omori Prison Camp, outside Tokyo. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamada sat hunched over a wooden table, his trembling hands gripping a pencil worn down to its stub. The former leader of the 341st Special Attack Squadron was writing something that would have been considered treason just 3 months earlier, the truth about what really happened to Japan's Divine Wind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Kamikaze missions weren't failing because of mechanical problems or poor weather. They weren't being stopped by anti-aircraft fire or ship-mounted guns. They were being systematically slaughtered by an invisible enemy that most pilots never even saw coming. American combat air patrols were shooting down 9 out of every 10 suicide planes before they could even glimpse their targets. Through the barred window of his cell, Yamada could see the skeleton of what used to be the Nakajima aircraft factory. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had spent the war's final year sending boys to die in planes that never had a chance, while believing their sacred mission was striking fear into American hearts. The interrogation rooms had become confessionals where Japan's surviving kamikaze commanders faced a devastating reality. Their divine wind had been nothing more than young men flying into a carefully orchestrated slaughter. The American officers conducting these interviews weren't looking for confessions of war crimes. They wanted to understand how an entire military strategy could have been based on such a fundamental misunderstanding of enemy capabilities. What emerged from these sessions would reveal the most systematic deception, not of the enemy, but of themselves. The roots of Japan's fatal kamikaze miscalculation began not in 1944 when the suicide attacks started, but 2 years earlier when naval intelligence completely misread American defensive capabilities. Commander Hiroshi Nakamura, chief of the Navy's Aviation Intelligence Section, had spent months analyzing reports from surviving pilots who had encountered American carrier task forces. What he found in those debriefings should have ended the kamikaze program before it began. Pilot after pilot described the same phenomenon. American fighters appearing in formations of 20 to 30 aircraft, operating in carefully coordinated layers extending 40 to 60 miles from their carrier groups. These weren't random patrols stumbling upon Japanese attack formations. They were precisely orchestrated defensive screens that seemed to know exactly where Japanese planes were coming from. Nakamura's reports, later discovered in naval archives by occupation forces, painted a picture of American air defense that bordered on the supernatural. Lieutenant Kenji Sasaki, one of the few survivors of the October 1942 raids on Task Force 61, described encountering what he called walls of fighters that appeared with mathematical precision. His testimony, recorded in Nakamura's classified files, was chilling in its detail. They knew we were coming before we knew ourselves. At exactly 0847 hours, 36 F-4F Wildcats rose from below the cloud layer in perfect formation. They had been waiting, not patrolling, waiting. They struck our formation of 18 bombers and escort fighters like they were executing a pre-planned maneuver. 14 of our planes died in the first 90 seconds. I counted the American losses, 0. But Sasaki's account was dismissed by senior commanders as the confused recollection of a traumatized pilot. Vice Admiral Takejiro Omishi, who would later create the official kamikaze program, wrote in his response to Nakamura's intelligence brief that individual pilot testimony lacks strategic perspective. The enemy appears more capable than they are because our pilots see only their immediate tactical situation. This dismissal would prove catastrophically wrong. Nakamura had discovered something that Japanese military doctrine couldn't comprehend. The Americans weren't just defending their ships, they were operating an integrated air defense system that turned the space around their task forces into killing fields for approaching aircraft. The missed warning signs accumulated throughout 1943. Flight Petty Officer Masao Inuma, returning from a reconnaissance mission over American positions in the Solomon Islands, reported seeing training exercises where American fighters practice intercept patterns with the precision of airshow performers. His detailed sketch showed F-6 Hellcats operating in what he described as layer cake formations. Fighters stacked at different altitudes, creating multiple intercept opportunities for any approaching enemy aircraft. Inuma's intelligence was filed away and forgotten. The concept of layered air defense was so foreign to Japanese tactical thinking that it simply didn't register as significant. Japanese fighters operated as individual warriors, relying on pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability. The idea of systematic, coordinated intercept patterns seemed unnecessarily complex and therefore impractical. Commander Nakamura tried repeatedly to convince his superiors that American air defense represented a qualitative shift in naval warfare. His November 1943 analysis, discovered decades later in captured files, contained a prescient warning. The enemy has transformed the airspace around their ships into a controlled environment. They do not simply react to attacks, they manage their defensive perimeter like a ground-based anti-aircraft installation, but with mobility and flexibility that exceeds anything we have encountered. The analysis included detailed calculations based on pilot reports. American combat air patrols maintained constant coverage using a rotation system that kept fresh fighters in the air around the clock. Japanese intelligence estimated that a typical American carrier task force kept between 60 and 80 fighters airborne continuously, with additional aircraft ready for immediate launch. In contrast, Japanese carriers struggled to maintain 12 fighters on patrol, and those pilots were often flying extended missions that left them exhausted and less effective. The numerical disparity was devastating, but Japanese commanders focused on the wrong numbers. They saw American fighters as individual opponents to be defeated in aerial combat, not as components of an integrated defense system designed to prevent enemy aircraft from reaching their targets. The intelligence failure became institutionalized when Admiral Soemu Toyoda assumed command of the combined fleet in May 1944. Toyoda, a veteran of traditional naval warfare, reviewed Nakamura's reports and concluded that American defensive capabilities were being overestimated by pilots who had failed in their missions. His response, documented in Navy Ministry files, revealed the depth of Japanese misunderstanding. Excessive focus on enemy defensive measures reflects a defeat mentality. Our pilots must be taught to expect fierce resistance and overcome it through superior fighting spirit. The enemy's apparent coordination simply indicates they have more aircraft, a material advantage that can be overcome through tactical superiority and self-sacrifice. This mindset would prove fatal when the Kamikaze program began in October 1944. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. The entire strategic concept was built on the assumption that suicide attacks would succeed because pilots who weren't trying to survive could take greater risks and achieve surprise. What Japanese planners never understood was that American combat air patrols were designed to intercept aircraft long before they could take any risks at all. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, the first official kamikaze pilot to score a hit on an American ship, struck the escort carrier St. Lo on October 25, 1944. His success was celebrated throughout Japan as proof that the divine wind could penetrate enemy defenses. What wasn't reported was that Seki's attack was part of a coordinated assault involving 55 aircraft, and he was one of only 4 pilots who managed to reach their targets. The other 51 kamikaze pilots were shot down by combat air patrols before they could even see American ships. Japanese commanders, receiving only reports of successful attacks, never learned about the systematic destruction of their suicide squadrons. The mathematical reality was hidden beneath individual stories of heroism and sacrifice. Flight Warrant Officer Saburo Yoshimura, one of the few kamikaze pilots who survived after his aircraft was damaged and forced to return, provided a detailed account of what really happened during these missions. His testimony, given years later to American investigators, described the kamikaze experience from the inside. We approached the target area at 6:30 hours, 18 aircraft in loose formation. At 6:34, we encountered the first group of American fighters, 24 F-6 Hellcats attacking from above and ahead. Within 60 seconds, 7 of our planes were burning and falling toward the ocean. We continued forward. At 6:38, a second group of fighters appeared from our right flank, another 30 aircraft in perfect formation. By 6:40, only 5 of us remained airborne. Yoshimura's account continued with horrifying detail. The surviving kamikaze pilots pressed forward, believing they were close to their targets. Instead, they encountered a third wave of interceptors, fresh fighters that had been positioned to catch any aircraft that survived the initial attacks. Only Yoshimura escaped, his engine smoking and controls damaged, and he never saw a single American ship. This pattern repeated itself hundreds of times throughout the Kamikaze campaign, but Japanese commanders never understood what was happening. They received reports that their Divine Wind pilots had died in glorious battle, never learning that most died in systematic executions carried out by combat air patrols operating with clockwork precision. The deception was complete because it was self-inflicted. Japanese military culture made it impossible to acknowledge that their most sacred military strategy was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of modern naval warfare. The Divine Wind wasn't failing because of cowardice or mechanical problems. It was being systematically destroyed by an enemy defense system that Japanese doctrine couldn't even recognize, let alone counter. By December 1944, American combat air patrols were intercepting kamikaze formations with such regularity that they had developed standardized procedures for what they called turkey shoots. Japanese suicide pilots flying predictable approach patterns at predetermined times had become target practice for American fighter squadrons that had perfected interception techniques through months of practice. The sacred mission that was supposed to save Japan had become a conveyor belt feeding young pilots into an invisible meat grinder, while commanders in Tokyo celebrated victories that existed only in their imagination. January 1945. The USS Enterprise Task Force cruised 200 miles southeast of Kyushu, its radar screens painting a picture of approaching death that Japanese pilots couldn't imagine. In the Combat Information Center, 23-year-old radar operator First Class Robert Chen watched green blips materialize on his scope. 18 aircraft flying in formation toward his ship, still 90 miles away. What those Japanese kamikaze pilots didn't know was that they had been tracked since takeoff. American radar technology had evolved far beyond Japanese comprehension, creating an invisible dome of detection that extended over 100 miles from each carrier group. Every kamikaze mission was observed, analyzed, and countered before the pilots even reached international waters. Lieutenant Commander James Sullivan, the Enterprise Air Group commander, received the radar contact report at 13:27 hours. Within 4 minutes, he had vectored 36 F-6 Hellcats toward the incoming threat. The American fighters would intercept the kamikaze formation 65 miles from their target, so far from the American ships that the Japanese pilots would die without ever knowing what they had been trying to attack. This technological superiority wasn't accidental. It was the result of a massive American investment in radar development that had begun before Pearl Harbor and accelerated throughout the war. By 1945, every American carrier carried multiple radar systems that created overlapping fields of detection. Search radars spotted incoming aircraft at extreme range. Height-finding radars determined altitude. Fighter direction radars guided interceptors to their targets with mathematical precision. Captain Minoru Watanabe, former commander of the Zuikaku, testified during post-war interrogations about his shock at discovering American radar capabilities. His carrier group had approached an American task force in the Philippine Sea, believing they were achieving tactical surprise. Instead, they found American fighters waiting in perfect ambush formation. We had maintained radio silence for 6 hours. Our approach was planned to avoid detection until the final attack phase. Yet when our strike aircraft reached the target area, enemy fighters were positioned exactly where they needed to be to intercept our formations. They knew our altitude, our heading, and our numbers. It was as if they had copies of our flight plans. Watanabe's confusion was understandable. Japanese radar technology lagged years behind American developments. Japan's best shipboard radars had detection ranges of 20 to 30 miles under ideal conditions. American radar could track aircraft formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles, and their systems operated reliably in weather conditions that rendered Japanese equipment useless. The technological gap extended far beyond detection range. American radar operators received months of specialized training, learning to interpret scope patterns and coordinate with fighter directors. Japanese radar operators were often regular sailors given basic instruction in equipment operation. The human element of radar warfare favored the Americans as decisively as the technology itself. Fighter pilot First Class Hiroshi Okamura, one of only 6 pilots to survive the massive Kamikaze assault on Task Force 58 in March 1945, described the American interception process from the receiving end. His account, given to Allied investigators in 1946, revealed the precision of American defensive coordination. At 14:45 hours, 47 of us departed Kanoya Airfield for a special attack mission against enemy carriers reported south of Okinawa. We flew in 3 formations at different altitudes, believing this would complicate enemy defensive responses. At 16:32, still 70 kilometers from the reported target position, American fighters appeared simultaneously above, below, and on both flanks of our formations. Okamura's testimony continued with devastating detail. The American interceptors weren't responding to visual contact or random patrol encounters. They had been guided to specific intercept positions by radar controllers who knew exactly where the Japanese formations would be at predetermined times. The attack wasn't a battle. It was an execution carried out with scientific precision. The enemy fighters attacked in coordinated waves, each group striking from a different angle. They had been positioned to maximize their advantage and minimize ours. Within 12 minutes, 38 of our aircraft were destroyed. The remaining pilots pressed forward, but we encountered fresh fighters that appeared to be waiting for survivors. Only 3 aircraft reached the target area, and I saw no successful attacks before my engine was hit and I was forced to withdraw. American combat air patrol doctrine had evolved into a sophisticated system that Japanese strategists never understood. Fighter directors aboard carriers used radar information to position interceptors in 3-dimensional space, creating multiple intercept opportunities for every approaching threat. Fresh squadrons were held in reserve to catch aircraft that survived initial encounters, ensuring that few enemy planes could reach their targets. The mathematical precision of this system was documented in American after-action reports that Japanese commanders never saw. A typical combat air patrol operation involved 60 to 80 fighters operating in coordinated layers. Inner patrols maintained close escort for the task force. Middle patrols operated 20 to 40 miles out, positioned to intercept aircraft that penetrated the outer screen. Outer patrols extended 50 to 70 miles from the carriers, engaging threats at maximum range. This layered defense was supported by radar picket destroyers positioned up to 60 miles from the main force. These ships provided early warning and extended radar coverage, creating a detection net that few aircraft could penetrate unobserved. Japanese kamikaze formations flying toward American task forces were tracked from takeoff to destruction, their every movement monitored and countered. Lieutenant Keisuke Yamamoto, executive officer of the 205th Naval Air Group, attempted to adapt kamikaze tactics to counter American defensive measures. His innovations, documented in captured operational orders, revealed both Japanese determination and their fundamental misunderstanding of what they faced. Yamamoto proposed attacks at dawn and dusk when American radar effectiveness might be reduced. He suggested approaching at wave-top altitude to minimize detection range. He organized formations to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm defensive responses. Every innovation failed because it was based on the assumption that Americans were reacting to visual contact rather than directing coordinated responses based on long-range detection. The dawn attacks failed because American radar operated effectively regardless of lighting conditions. Low-altitude approaches were detected by specialized radars designed to track sea-skimming aircraft. Multi-directional attacks were defeated by combat air patrols that had been positioned to intercept threats from any bearing, guided by radar controllers who could track multiple formations simultaneously. By April 1945, American fighter squadrons had developed such confidence in their interception capabilities that they began treating kamikaze missions as routine training exercises. Squadron records from VF-83 aboard the Essex show that pilots competed to see who could achieve the most kills during kamikaze interceptions, with some aviators scoring 5 or 6 victories in a single engagement. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was devastating. Flight Warrant Officer Saburo Tanaka, who participated in 7 kamikaze escort missions and survived because his aircraft developed mechanical problems each time, described the growing despair among pilots who witnessed systematic destruction of their formations. The Americans were always waiting. No matter what time we attacked, what altitude we chose, what approach we used, their fighters appeared in perfect formation exactly where they needed to be. Some pilots began to believe the enemy possessed supernatural powers. Others concluded that we had spies reporting our every move. The truth was worse. We were fighting an enemy whose technology made our tactics obsolete. American radar picket ships extended this technological advantage even further. The destroyer USS Aaron Ward, stationed 60 miles northwest of Okinawa, detected and reported kamikaze formations while they were still forming up over their departure airfields. This advance warning allowed American task forces to position interceptors and prepare for attacks hours before enemy aircraft appeared on their own radar screens. The radar revolution had transformed naval warfare in ways that Japanese military doctrine couldn't accommodate. Traditional concepts of surprise, concealment, and tactical deception became meaningless against an enemy who could see everything within a 100-mile radius. Kamikaze pilots were flying into a transparent battlefield, where their every movement, analysis, and countered by defenders who possessed complete situational awareness. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi, senior staff officer for Admiral Onishi's First Air Fleet, later testified that Japanese commanders never understood the scope of American technological superiority. They knew the enemy had radar, but they conceptualized it as an improved form of visual observation, rather than a revolutionary technology that had fundamentally altered the nature of air combat. This misunderstanding persisted until the war's end. Japanese kamikaze pilots continued flying missions based on tactical concepts from an earlier era, while American defenders operated with technological capabilities that belonged to the future. The divine wind was being systematically extinguished by an invisible enemy that Japanese pilots never saw coming and commanders never understood. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.